Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being with us on behalf of the Boca Raton Synagogue and our Mind, Body, Soul theme for this month of Elul. It's not too late to join our Mind, Body, Soul challenges. If you go to brsonline.org/Elul, you'll find 9 challenges, beginner, intermediate, and advanced in the areas of mind, body, and soul. We have 9 WhatsApp groups for things like benching from a bencher, doing a plank every day, walking the circle, turning your phone off while you daven. We have 9 different challenges. Not too late to be able to join. And tonight, as we focus on the mind, we are so grateful to have a real expert, Dr. Norman Blumenthal, who is a close friend of our community, who has been such a resource and a source of comfort, of strength, of wisdom, of support to many in our community in some of their most difficult and painful moments in their lives. You've taught us, Dr. Blumenthal, of issues of marriage and unfortunately of divorce and of resilience, which is our topic for tonight, how to build resilience and bounce back from difficult times. For those who don't know, Dr. Blumenthal is Education Director at the Wexner Kol Elyon Smicha program at REITs at Yeshiva University, a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice. He's also the chair in trauma and crisis counseling at OHEL Center for Trauma, Bereavement, and Crisis Response. You know that Dr. Blumenthal is sought after from around the world for his wisdom, his knowledge, his sensitivity. I feel grateful to call him a friend. I've turned to for advice and wisdom on many occasions. And I want to thank Rabbi Blumenthal not only for giving his time tonight in general, but he's a little bit under the weather. And nevertheless, persevered. So on that topic of resiliency and tenacity and bouncing back, wish you a refuah shlema, feel better. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thank you all for being with us. There'll be an opportunity for questions, but I think probably the most efficient way to do it would be to submit questions in the chat, which either Dr. Blumenthal will read towards the end or I can read towards the end. So without any further ado, it is an honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Norman Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and thanks for the gracious introduction. I hope deservedly so. I have to tell you, and I do feel a special kinship to the Boca Raton community. I've been there many times, such a beautiful, special community, and certainly the kinship that I feel both with Rabbi Goldberg and with Rabbi Moskowitz, as I often mention, the pastoral psychology course that I've been teaching now for close to 20 years at the Yeshiva University is named after Rabbi Goldberg's grandparents, the Abbas, and it's really, I have a weekly reminder of this very central role that he and his family plays in the education of rabbis and in the Orthodox community. Presenting to your shul, I have to say, is both exciting and scary. It's exciting because I know, given having heard your shiurim from Rabbi Goldberg and Rabbi Moskowitz, both live and on yutorah.org, I know the level of erudition that you're used to. So it's very exciting that I'm part of that group. It's scary because I know the level of lectures that you hear from Rabbi Goldberg and Rabbi Moskowitz, and I know the expectations that you have. So I'm coming with these mixed feelings. I will be speaking for about 45 minutes. This is the plan that I put together with Rabbi Moskowitz. And I will then take questions for about 15 minutes. I was asked to speak about the mind. And as I was thinking about it, I remember a thought I used to have as a high school student, as a college student. When I was in YU, I never was zochet to be in Rabbi Soloveitchik's shiur, but I used to attend a lot of his public lectures. And of course, to get there, you had to come an hour and a half early, and there would be 3-hour lectures that felt like 10 minutes. But the sheer brilliance that I would see, or even in the shiur that I was in with Ravan Kreis, who was also probably one of the most outstanding Talmidei Chachamim to ever be on these shores. And I would look at them and I'd say to myself, you know, their hat size is the same as mine. Their mind, their brain isn't any bigger. How come they have so much in there and I don't? And I think it just speaks to the complexity and the enormity of the brain, that there is the mind, that there's so much that's going on there. I might actually be a little disappointing you because I'm actually not going to really focus on resilience. Rabbi Moskowitz gave me a little elbow room. He mentioned that as a possibility, but he wanted some topic related to the mind. And as I was thinking about this, I thought that maybe it would make sense that we're being in Chodesh Elul, and we're coming to the season of change and growth. So it's not quite resilience and bouncing back, but it is similar, to understand how change occurs or how growth occurs. How does that occur, and what is the mental process of this kind of growth or this kind of change. And I'm in the change business. This is what I do for a living. And therefore, it's of extreme interest, and it's really been my pursuit. How do we help people grow, and how do we help people change? And how do we do it? What exactly happens? So let me start by telling you that we as human beings don't like change. We actually naturally resist change because we're comfortable with the way things are. We're comfortable with the way we are. And therefore, we're not going to want to venture out much. You know, in therapy, we often speak about that as resistance. That's the term. That when you're helping a patient grow or change, they're going to resist it. And in fact, they're supposed to. In fact, often when I do training and I'm training residents or interns in therapy, and if they report a certain type of growth or change that came too easy, I warn them it's probably not sustainable. It's probably not real, because real change comes with 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, with the patient literally fighting you because they don't want to give up the life that they had. I remember many years ago, when my kids were young, we did spend a Pesach in Miami, and we went to the parrot jungle. And I'm sure it's a site you're all familiar with. And they have a very small primate section. And we went there, and it was small enough that you could actually talk to the attendants and while they were attending to the monkeys, etc. And, you know, of course, we happened to come at feeding time, maybe because it was Pesach, so they're constantly feeding everybody. And we noticed that as the attendants walked in and out of the cages, they were a little, how should I put, lackadaisical about locking and closing behind them. Sometimes they left them open, the cage open for a minute or two as they got items or they went back and forth. So I asked them, I said, aren't you afraid that the monkeys are going to escape? And one of the attendants said something to me that I thought was so symbolic of human beings. She said, as curious as they are about the big world out there, this is the place they know, and they're going to be hesitant to leave it. And I thought that's so true of all of us. Sometimes we'll live in cages, and sometimes we'll confine ourselves because that's what we know, and that's what we're comfortable with. And therefore, we resist this kind of change, and we thrive on consistency. In fact, sometimes some of the changes that some of the behaviors that we engage in are behaviors that at earlier points in our life, and sometimes even difficult times of our life, we're very adaptive, we're very useful. And we continue to apply them, even though it's not necessary. We could be very defensive because maybe at some point in our lives, we were in a very vulnerable place. And now we're not in that vulnerable place anymore, where we still get very defensive and argumentative, maybe in a self-protective kind of way, because it worked for us once. And part of the work is to learn that the situation has changed and we don't have to interact in that fashion. Again, I remember I'm recalling, yes, my college years a lot when I was in YU, there were a bunch of articles coming up in which what happened was that they would discover on some deserted Pacific island a Japanese soldier who had no idea that World War II had ended. And they were sitting there on this island with their submachine gun, living off of insects and plants, waiting for American airplanes to shoot it. And it was like 30 years later, and they would take them off this island and they'd take them to Japan and to Tokyo, and they would marvel at how much the place has changed. In fact, for the Purim edition of the college newspaper, we actually did a spoof on that. We did a spoof on someone who was found hidden in a corner of the base of Medrash in YU and had been hiding there for 30 years. And they took him out, they brought him to the base of Medrash, and actually it was all the same. It was the same chairs and the same Sfarim, the same Rebbeim, nothing had changed. But very often we're like that Japanese soldier. We're going to hold on and cling to the way we were because we don't want to chance something new. And that's very much a theme of therapy and very much a theme of change. So how do we change? What is the process of change? So first thing that we need is that something has to hurt. Something has to sort of put us in pain, or we have to face some failure or setback. Because without that kind of pain, we're not going to be motivated to change. And therefore, for example, as if I use the therapy model, very often what brings patients to therapy is some sort of, some of the questions we ask is, why now? Why are you coming now? And usually it is a marriage that there's too much conflict, a an inability to get along with co-workers, some other kind of blockage, not being able to succeed when the success is possibly in your way, and you're in pain and you're hurting, that's very often what is necessary. So in a way, in a paradoxical kind of way, a prerequisite for growth and change is pain. I want to read you a piece that was a speech that Chief Justice John Roberts gave during the commencement exercises of his son's graduation from the Cardigan Mountain School, June 3rd, 2017. He says, now the commencement speakers will typically also wish you good luck and extend good wishes to you. I will not do that, and I'll tell you why. From time to time in the years to come, I hope you will be treated unfairly so that you'll come to know the value of justice. I hope that you will suffer betrayal because that will teach you the importance of loyalty. Sorry to say, but I hope you'll be lonely from time to time so that you don't take friends for granted. I wish you bad luck, again from time to time, so that you'll be conscious of the role of chance in life and understand that your success is not completely deserved and that the failure of others is not completely deserved either. And when you lose, as you will from time to time, hope every now and then your opponent will gloat over your failure. It is a way for you to understand the importance of sportsmanship. I hope you'll be ignored, so you know the importance of listening to others. And I hope you'll have just enough pain to learn compassion. Whether I wish these things or not, they're going to happen. And whether you benefit from them or not will depend upon your ability to see the message in your misfortune. So number one is the fact that we need pain, we need setbacks in order to change. I mentioned before that I've spent many years supervising psychiatry residents, psychology interns. And you know, the year begins, as many of you know, the first week in July. So usually the first week of July is orientation. Second week, I get the interns or psychiatry residents that I'm supervising. And so in the very first meeting, I go over some of the expectations and some of et cetera, et cetera. And then I give them what had become, I think, my famous speech, which is, please make mistakes. Please make blunders. Because I've learned over the years that the people learning to do psychotherapy, the trainees who are afraid of mistakes, they pretty much sit on their hands. They don't do anything bad, and they don't do anything good either. And it is those who are willing to go out there, take chances, put their foot in their mouth, make a lot of mistakes, are the ones who learn. And I always would tell them, you worried about your evaluations? I'll give you your evaluation right now. You're going to get a good evaluation. Don't worry about it. Go out there and stumble. And that's how you're going to grow. And that's how you're going to change. And it's no accident that the day in our calendar most associated with change and growth, namely Yom Kippur, is also the day of Inui Nefesh. Is the day in which we put ourselves in pain. We deprive ourselves of food, we deprive ourselves of other pleasures and luxuries, because through the pain, that's how we grow. So that's step number one, to understand how people change or how we can change, is through pain. The other issue comes up, which is, what is the mechanism and the way in which we grow and change? And there's an age-old debate or dispute in the field of psychology, and I have to say it's probably by now largely resolved, but the debate is, what prompts change? Is it insight, or is it just change of behavior? Original field of psychology, which was dominated very much by psychoanalysis, by the early works of Freud, very much focused on insight. That if you understand your behaviors, if you understand what prompted the behaviors that got you in trouble, then you're in a much better position to change it. And therefore, change comes from understanding yourself, from analyzing yourself, from going back and understanding the antecedents. And by the way, this can be many. It can be your parents, although parents, by the most part, do a lot more good than harm. And we've been very, I think, guilty of parent abuse in the field. But it could be your neighborhood, your culture, your school, your friends, your siblings, which by the way is a very neglected area in terms of understanding beings. What impact our siblings have on us? We're much more focused on parents and we're much less focused on siblings, and siblings are a very big part of shaping us and making us into who we are. Our friendships, our marriages, our work relationships, all these experiences shape us. And to understand them, understand how they shape us, prompts us and gives us the capacity to be able to change. But insight alone doesn't do it. Imagine you go to some, let's say some very erudite psychoanalyst, and you tell your life story and he pieces it all together and explains exactly why you are who you are. That alone, it'll make you maybe smarter. It might be very interesting. It's not going to change you, because if you don't take that insight and put it into action, it's useless. In fact, one of the concepts in psychotherapy is what we call working through, which is when somebody has achieved an understanding or has achieved a capacity to change something, they have to weave it into every part of their life. It's not enough just to know it. You have to put it into your relationships, you have to put it into your work, you have to put it into the way you conduct yourself privately. And by weaving it in, that's how change takes place. And that very much fits with the very famous line of Socrates: an unexamined life is not worth living. But it has to be more as well. And there is also certainly a lot of evidence that sometimes just changing your behavior, even if you don't understand where it comes from, and even if you don't understand what governs it, by acting and doing something, that changes you. In other words, the change doesn't have to come from awareness into action, but change can take place from action and then enter into your awareness. Let me give you some examples. There's a very famous study, and probably most of you have heard of it, and if you haven't, it's worth knowing about, and that's the famous prison guard study. And what the investigator did was he hired people, or he got volunteers, to be actors in a play. And the play was about these very vicious prison guards who beat and tormented and tortured the inmates. And everybody in the skit knew that it was acting. And everybody knew that the so-called leather whips that they were using were really cotton and wasn't really hurting the person. And everybody knew that the person, the actor who played the part of the prisoner, who was shrieking and screaming in pain, was just acting. It wasn't really what was happening. And yet, when they did an evaluation before and after the performance of this play, they found that those who played the parts of the prison guards reported more agitation, more aggression, that somehow or another, just even role playing that act, being that person as an actor, impacted on who they are, just the sheer behavior. In fact, I was told, I didn't get this from a reliable source, I don't know if it's true, but it's so good, it's worth saying anyway. I was told that the person who played the camp commandant in Schindler's List, the sadistic, horrific commander of the camp, needed therapy afterwards, because playing out those scenes again and again had a really corrosive effect on him that he needed help with. A similar story comes to mind, is actually a personal story from my family. And it's a story about my father, Olav Shalom, who actually his yahrzeit is next week, who was born in Frankfurt in Germany and came to this country at the age of 18 in 1937. His two older siblings, my aunt and my Aunt Edith, my uncle Martin, were already here. In fact, Martin is the father of the United States Senator from Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, happens to be my first cousin. They were already here, and my father had a 3-week trip across the ocean. There was supposed to be kosher food. There wasn't kosher food, so he was living on vegetables and fruit for 3 weeks, and he arrived. He was famished. They picked him up from the port. They took him to their apartment on 88th Street and Broadway. They just put down his luggage. They took him down to 42nd Street, Times Square, where there was a kosher deli, so he could have a good meal. And they sat over the meal in this kosher deli, and they had a whole conversation in German about what was going on at home, about their parents, etc. When the meal was over, my father's brother and sister said to him, "Okay, we're in America now. That was our last German conversation. From now on, We only speak English. And kachaya. They never spoke German to each other again. Maybe they spoke German around my grandfather, who never really mastered English. And I know my uncle, when he was much older, had a stroke. Somehow he lapsed into German, but never did they. English became the language in which they spoke with one another. Again, the action, doing it, makes you, helps you redefine yourself and makes you a changed person. And indeed, today, most therapeutic techniques have integrated the two. Most therapeutic techniques that are involved in human change are a combination of an element of awareness, cognition, with the essential part of actually putting it into practice. And part of it is also, part of change as well, is a self-redefinition. It's not enough just to change your behavior, and that's why perhaps the insight part is important, but you come to redefine yourself. You change how you understand yourself. Dr. Tversky, Abraham Tversky, the famous psychiatrist who did a lot of work in alcoholism, once quoted a patient of his who said, "The person I was drank. The person I was will drink again." It's not enough to just stop drinking. You have to coming to stopping the drinking, you have to define yourself as a recovered alcoholic. You have to define yourself as someone who no longer drinks. This has been very poignantly paraphrased and said by Rabbi Soloveitchik. And again, I have to ask Rishus of Rabbi Goldberg, since I'm bringing some Divrei Torah. But in Al HaTshuva, in his seminal work on what tshuva is, and in it, I'm not going to read the Hebrew, I'm just going to very roughly paraphrase it, but he differentiates between kapara and tahara. Kapara is forgiving and asking for forgiveness. Tahara is a change in your basic sense of how you define yourself. And I'm just going to have it here in Hebrew, but I'll just paraphrase it. He said, in the words of Maimonides, Acherhu, he's a different person now. There's a change in his identity. The person who committed the sins was no longer the person whom he sees himself as today. It's a change of person. You have a new personality. You have a new heart. You have a new soul. You have a new theophilosophical approach. You have different tendencies. He says here, and I'll just read this very last part. He said, Adam echad yorei v'tovel. One person actually goes into the mikveh. Keshehu oleh min hatfilah. When he comes out, Ola Adam Acher, he comes out a different person. Yored Ruvain Achote, Ruvain, the one who did the sin, goes into the mikveh. Ola Shimon HaTahar, and Shimon comes out, who is now, if you will, Tahar, is more pure, is more free of sin. And that is part and parcel of change, and that's why the insight and the behavior have to come hand in hand. Because it's not enough just to change your behavior. As you change, you sort of redefine yourself. Your self-concept goes through a metamorphosis as well. But part of changing also means accepting that which can change and that which cannot. We're becoming increasingly aware that so much of who we are is to some extent constitutional. And the change that takes place has to occur within the confines of who you are. We're becoming aware more and more so. One of the most cutting edge, if you will, or exciting new areas in understanding human beings and understanding how human beings change is the area of genetics. And we're becoming aware more and more that people have genetic predispositions, not only for intelligence, not only for musical acumen, not only for athleticism, but people have genetic predispositions for depression, anxiety, even certain types of personalities. And one of the most exciting things you can do for a research psychologist is give him an MRA. MRA stands for monozygotic twins raised apart. Take identical twins, raise one in Borough Park and raise one in Tucson, Arizona, and bring them together when they're like 40 years old, where they have the same genetic makeup. And they're, in some respects, very different, but they're remarkably similar. There are incredible similarities that take place. So we are, to some extent, even though we try to change, a lot of who we are is immutable. A lot of who we are is fixed. There's, many of you might be familiar with the Serenity Prayer. The Serenity Prayer is almost the gospel of the 12-step programs. It was conceived in a little stone cottage in Heath, Massachusetts by Reinhold Niebuhr, and is written like this: God, give us the grace to accept with serenity the changes the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish one from the other. And that is also part of change. I often tell patients of mine when we're talking about what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to do in therapy, I tell them, I'm not going to change you. I'm going to make you better at who you are, because I can't make an inherently shy, socially withdrawn person into a social butterfly. And I can't make an energetic, high-strung person into a beachcomber in California. But within the sort of rubric, within the confines of who you are, I can help you maximize your skills. I can help you maximize your talents and your abilities. There's an amazing book. It's not a hard read if you're interested, and many of you may have heard of it. It's called The Psychopath Inside, a neuroscientist's personal journey into the dark side of the brain. It's written by James Fallon. And here is basically his story. This James Fallon is a psychologist, and his area of interest is psychopaths. Psychopaths are not very popular patients. Psychopaths very often are criminals, people lacking in a developed conscience, the kind of adults or children who will do very cruel and heartless things with little regard for the other person. And he had some pretty compelling data that there was a unique brain structure to the psychopath. And he would take MRIs of the brain and identify some of the differences in terms of the basic neuroanatomy of the psychopath versus the normal person. He would work a lot in prisons. He would take MRIs of the brains of some of these prisoners, some of these very scary people, and he would compare them then to a normal population and look for the differences. One day he was doing one of his studies, and he had, let's say, I think it was like 40 images of the psychopath, and he needed 40 images of the non-psychopath, the normal person, to compare the brains, and he only had 39 of the normal ones. So he said to his researchers, he says, you know what? Take an MRI of my brain, and then it'll be 40-40. So they took an MRI of his brain, and you know what he discovered? He had the exact brain of the psychopath. And he found that very peculiar, because he was a law-abiding citizen who really, never did anything really criminal or anything like that, and yet he had the brain of the psychopath. And he kind of just laughed it off. And once he was at a family gathering, and he mentions, I believe if I remember the story correctly, it might be, but sometimes my memory plays tricks on me, but he mentioned something to his mother about how strange it was that he had the brain of the psychopath. At which point she started to turn white and get all upset. And he was wondering, and then she finally explained to him that he comes from generations of criminals. He had an Alta Zeta who was a serial killer, and had a grandfather who was a bank robber. And indeed, there is a psychopathic tendencies that run in his family. And as he started thinking about that, he realized that, he has some of those tendencies. He channeled them in constructive ways, and that might have even been why he took such a fascination and interest in the psychopath. And he pursued it further, and then he wrote this book. And it shows you that we are sort of, who we are is very much governed sometimes by factors such as genetics, and sometimes by factors such as brain structure, but it's what we do with it. And it's within those confines that we grow and we change, and we try to become excellent and better people. In fact, this is it might seem like a little bit of a tangent, but this issue raises a very interesting, both ethical and educational question. And the question is, are we losing the concept of a Russia? Are we losing the concept of an evil person? We are taught, a basic sort of chazal, is that the world can be divided in three pieces. There are tzaddikim, those rare groups that are just exceptionally good people. There are the rishoim, the evil, bad people. And then there's most of us that fall somewhere in between, the beinonim. But do we still have a concept of Russia? And interestingly enough, this first came up in my work I'm guessing now it's almost 10 years ago, after the horrific murder of Leiby Kletsky, something I'm sure we all remember, the young Hasidic boy who was on his way home from day camp, was abducted by a member of the Orthodox community, a man by the name of Levi Aaron, and was both murdered and dismembered. And of course, this was all over the news. I mean, actually, I have to say it was one of the biggest Kiddush Hashem I ever saw, because I visited with the Kletsky family the night before they found him, and you had to see what Brooklyn looked like. Everywhere you look, people with flashlights, screaming, Leiby, 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 climbing up railroad embankments. It was really a remarkable sight. But after this came out, one of the questions that we grappled with is, how do we explain to our children who Levi Aaron is? Is he a Russia, or is he a sick man? And he happened to have someone with mental illness. How do we explain it? And there was really no answer. Because you have to understand that the study of human behavior is a relatively new area. Why we behave a certain way, the study of the mind is relatively new. And for most of mankind, most of history, we didn't really ponder how people became who they were. This was Freud wrote his first books towards the end of the 19th century. And it's only in more recent years that we're trying to understand and explain human behavior. But if we can explain why people turn out the way they do, then why is anybody responsible for any actions that they take? If we can, maybe I'm going to just use some hyperbole, but maybe Osama bin Laden was bullied as a child. And maybe Charles Manson came from a broken home. And how do we understand human culpability or responsibility when we know so much about how people become who they are? I remember this, one of the first times this hit me was I was asked to do a presentation in a school about a condition called ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. There are certain people who by nature are oppositional. You tell them it's day, they'll tell you it's night. You say turn right, they'll tell you turn left. And there are children like that who are just diffident by nature. And I'm explaining to the teachers that this is their personality, this is their character. And one of the teachers said, so then there's no discipline. How can I discipline a child for being disrespectful? How can I discipline a child? And if this is his basic makeup, if this is his genetic makeup. And we're losing the sense of personal culpability. Now, I don't want to, give up completely. I think what most people will tell you is that with our increased awareness and the need for self-awareness, if you know you have certain tendencies, then you have to work harder on yourself. And you have to be aware of it. It's a matter of awareness. So there still is some responsibility, but it's become more of a challenge as we better understand human behavior. And then again, the other issue is, should we completely change? What is change just radically becoming a different person? Or does change mean preserving certain parts of yourself that should be and are immutable, and correcting that which needs to be corrected? Were a person to say, I have to change, and he throws away his religion, and he throws away his background, and he dyes his hair completely different, he moves to a completely place, he assumes a totally different identity. Is that real change? Or is change something that occurs within the context of preservation and preserving that which needs to be preserved? My mother, Leah Shalom, who was a survivor of 7 concentration camps, after many years of not talking about, finally did begin to speak up, and we prevailed upon her to give the famous testimony, the testimony that was conducted by Spielberg. Originally it was by Yale, and she gave a riveting testimony about her experiences during the Holocaust. And there's one story I'm going to share with you, and in fact, when my first granddaughter named after her was born, my son referenced this story as well. It was towards the end of the war, and she was on the notorious death marches. As you know, what they did was they took the Jews, just literally ran them through Poland, Germany, and they had many different slave labor jobs, the group my mother was with was responsible for cleaning up the rubble after the Allied bombings. And at this point, she was in Altona, which is a port city in Germany. So it got the brunt of the bombings to disrupt their supplies. And they would have to come out, the Jewish inmates, and clean up the rubble. And one day, she was walking towards the site where she had to clean up the rubble, and she saw a horrific sight. It seems what had happened was that when the bombing started the night before, the Germans ran out of their apartments to try to get to shelters. And because of the heat of the bombs, the asphalt had melted. So they stepped into this burning hot asphalt. They got stuck, and because of the enormous amount of heat, they literally burned to death. So she saw literally figurines, men, women, children, stuck in this cement and burned alive. And when she saw that, she was horrified and she felt terribly sorry for them. She had an enormous amount of pity for the horrific death. And then she said, and again, she was a teenager at the time, she said she got very confused. She said, wait a minute, these are the Nazis. These are the people who have killed my entire family. Why am I feeling sorry for them? And then she said she had an exhilarating moment, almost like a high. She realized, you know what? The Nazis took away my family. They stole the most precious years of my life. They tortured and they starved me, but they didn't take away my moral compass. They didn't take away my capacity to have compassion. And she has tremendous gratitude at that point, that she could live through all that and still hold on to her compassion. And that's part of change as well. We change, but we hold on to what's important. Also, change optimally occurs in an interpersonal context. It's because it's an interesting phenomena that if we were to take a child and put them in isolation, feed them, clothe them, give them everything they want, but let them have no interactions with others, they'd have no concept of who they are. As I indicated, we're born with all sorts of tendencies, but we're not born with a self-concept. Our sense of who we are or who we need to be is engendered by our contact with others. In early years, with our contact with parents, later on with friends, later on with a spouse, with children even. Through our other people in our lives, in many respects, are the mirrors and reflect back to us who we are. And that's why, interestingly enough, the treatment that is associated with change is an interpersonal type of treatment. It's a relationship. You don't necessarily have to have a relationship with your plumber to have your pipes fixed. You don't even have to have an interpersonal relationship with your dentist necessarily to have your cavities filled. But therapy takes place in interpersonal context. In fact, sometimes when people ask me for referrals, I not only have to think about a person who's adept in that particular field, I also have to think about how this particular person will relate and connect to that person. And indeed, I have to tell you that for myself, one of the scariest aspects of my field is how important I become to other people, how indispensable I may come to others. And what happens if I have a sleepless night? What happens if I have pneumonia and I'm just not myself? Is that fair to the other person? And that's very important. So again, we change through our interaction. In fact, it's interesting, if again, with the Rishos of Rabbi Goldberg, there's a very interesting situation that happens early in Parshas Bereshis. Adam Arishon realizes he's alone. He doesn't have a wife. There's a shidduch crisis in Gan Eden. So what do? So you write a resume, you call the local shadchanim. No, what does God do? He takes them and he shows them all the animals and he tells them, name the animals. Right, so this one's a horse and this one's a mule and this one's a chicken and names all the animals. And then it said, and he couldn't find a wife. And then God brought Chava into the world. Now, two obvious questions is, first of all, why was it necessary for him to engage in practice of zoology and name all the animals? And was he seriously going to consider one of the animal spouses as his? Was he going to marry a giraffe? I mean, what was going on there? Well, Samson Hirsch explains something. He says the word shame, name, the same word as sham, there. The animal, when they get married, so they can procreate, and maybe there's some division of labor, but they don't change. They don't grow through marriage. The tiger, when it's single, is pretty much the same tiger was when it's married. But he needed Nezer Connecto. He needed someone who'll challenge him. Man needed somebody with whom he can have meaningful interactions and grow, not to be stagnant. And that was the process through what was going on at that time. Just one or two more points. I see I'm coming towards the end of my time, so mention them. Change also means, by the way, being in the right times, being in your times. One of the things I really can't handle personally is I often refer to as hand wringing, or otherwise known as, oh, the good old days. The good old days when we used to write letters and not send emails. Oh, the good old days when we would, have 9-to-5 jobs and not be on Zoom and working at all sorts of bizarre hours. And I have no doubt that some of the earlier and simpler times were very pleasant and had certain benefits. But that's not how God made the world. God made the world with progress. And in every generation, we move ahead. There are new discoveries. We go from horses to cars, from cars to planes, to driverless cars. It's built into the creation. There's change, and we have to grow and change and adapt to some of the new reality that exists out there. So, for example, one of the issues that comes up sometimes is, let's say, should you take notes by hand, or should you take notes on the laptop in college? And there is some data that suggests that the material is retained better if you take notes by hand. And so some people are saying, no, everybody has to write notes the old-fashioned way. And one of my feeling is, no, let's figure out how to take notes in the computer in a way that we retain it better, because the computer is taking over. Or, as I like to very often quote, the great philosopher and theologian Wayne Gretzky, who used to say, I skate to where the puck is going and not to where it's been. And part of growth and change is skating to where the puck is going. And the last thought, and with that I'll conclude, is that interestingly enough, reality usually changes a lot quicker than the brain does. The brain is much slower in adapting to the reality than reality happens. And we're seeing this now with the COVID and with remote learning and all that comes with it, that it's taking us, our brain, a lot longer to adapt to this new reality. And the reality changed very, very quickly. A simple example is something that I'm sure many of you have witnessed, maybe even experienced. If you know somebody who was, let's say, by all standards obese, way overweight, and finally, enough warnings from the doctors and all that, they go to a nutritionist, they get put on a special diet, they shed 100 pounds, 150 pounds, and they look regular. They look like any other person. They may even look thin. And yet they'll tell you, they'll look in the mirror and they see a fat person, because the weight goes off quickly. But until the mind redefines themselves, it takes a long time. One of my favorite Gemaras is a Gemara in Sukkah. Again, I don't know the exact offhand, but the Gemara was a very famous one. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Gemara says that in the Acharis Hayamim, in the days to come, Hashem is going to show the Yetzer Hara, like called the evil inclination, I guess, to the tzaddikim, to the righteous people, and to the Rishonim, and to the bad people. And to the righteous people, the Yetzer Hara is going to look like a huge mountain. And to the evil people, it's going to look like a piece of thread. V'heim bochem, and they both cry. The evil person says, I let this little piece of thread get in my way. And the righteous person says, I actually climbed that mountain, because you can climb a mountain and not even be aware of it until much later. Let me conclude with a story, which is also, again, one of the most profound stories that I heard from my mother. Allah Shalom, my mother described to me once what she often described as one of the happiest moments of her life. The moment she realized she was liberated from the concentration camps. In actuality, this took place 1.5 years after her actual liberation. She was liberated from Bergen-Belsen in 1945. And as some of you may know, the Swedes took in some survivors. My mother told me they made it very clear they wanted them to leave. As soon as they came, they said, you have plans to leave, you have plans to constantly remind them. And most did leave, very few are left. But they lived in Sweden for my mother and her sister lived in Sweden for about a year and a half before they were able to immigrate to America. And she's a young 21-year-old who has spent the last 7 years of her life in various ways living under Nazi occupation. And there was a young male refugee there who sort of took a liking to her, and he asked her out on a date. It was the first date of her life. And he took her to a concert. And again, this is a year and a half after her liberation. And everything's fine. They're sitting there and talking, and suddenly there's a commotion, and everybody's looking towards the back of the concert hall. And it seems it was the custom in Sweden that the musicians would dress in uniforms and march in from the back of the concert hall. And she turns around, and there are these blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans in uniforms marching. And she said she went right back to the camps. She was right there. She heard the dogs barking, the shouting in German, the shooting, the terror, the screaming. She remembers her date talking to her, and it was like he was miles away. And then, to her utter joy and sheer amazement, these alleged Nazis sat down and played music. And she realized she was liberated. And that's what happens sometimes. The reality changes, we change. But until it registers, until we know it, that first time when somebody does something that would have provoked us to be angry, and we control ourselves. That first time when we had the tendency to sort of mess up and not care, and we catch ourselves and we work hard and succeed. Those are those exhilarating moments when we come to the realization or where change has taken place, even though the reality may have changed quite a while ago. I hope this has been helpful. And again, as I mentioned, I invite questions, comments, usually.
Thank you so much for an extraordinary presentation as always. I want to share with you, someone texted me privately, and I encourage people, if you want to write in the chat, we have a few more minutes. Dr. Blumenthal has graciously agreed to respond to questions. So someone texted privately, would an ODD, an oppositional defiant person, ever change? And what would that entail? What would that process look like? If a person's diagnosed with that, how can change ever happen for them?
Let me tell you two. You can tell I like stories. So let me tell you two of my favorite stories. One's about Bernard Baruch, who actually quotes the stories, and the other one's about Natan Sharansky. Bernard Baruch, who was one of the most brilliant investors, really built up a portfolio of unprecedented level, used to have a saying, and when people would ask him, how did he succeed? How did he know how to invest so well? And he used to say, when everybody buys, I sell. And when everybody sells, I buy. That's an oppositional defiant disorder. But that's using it in a very constructive way. The other story, which is really one of my favorite, many of you may know the story of Natan Sharansky. Many of you may remember the heroic events, this little 5'2" Russian Jew who took on the whole Soviet empire. And more even heroic, Avital, his wife, who fought like the Dickens, visited every world leader, the Pope, and everyone fighting for her husband. And remarkably, when he was finally freed, disappeared and was busy being a wife and mother. But that day finally came when they were going to let him go. And they brought him to a bridge. I don't know, maybe it was East Berlin, West Berlin, I'm not sure, but they brought him to a bridge. And on the other side of the bridge was everything he's been waiting for years. His wife, his family, the Americans, Israelis, this whole new life. And the KGB took him out of the car. They took off his handcuffs, and the KGB agent said, now walk straight across the bridge. And you know what he did? He walked in a crisscross across the bridge. Till the very end, he was not going to do what they're telling him to do. That's ODD. So to answer your question, and I think that speaks very much to what we're talking about in terms of change. I'm not going to change you. I'm going to make you better at who you are. ODD, there's a thin line between ODD and creativity. There's a very thin line between being imaginative and being ODD, because you think out of the box. You think creative ways. The difference is, and here's the important point, does the ODD own you, or do you own it? Do you know this about yourself? And you use it when it's indicated, and at times it's not indicated. When the police officer pulls you over for a speeding ticket, that's not the time to be ODD. That's the time to be very compliant and very respectful. But when it's applicable, when there's a room for creativity, when there's room for a chiddush in a Gemara, that's where the ODD is adaptively applied.
If I could ask just a follow-up question, not about this, but on the topic of resilience, which really is one of your areas of expertise, and I think that many people who are on tonight, there's such fatigue from this corona. We're exhausted. We're sick and tired of it. Many have become sort of hopeless or despondent to it. Experts are predicting who knows when, if, how we can get back to a life of normalcy. What are some of, as we're going into this Yom Tov season, which will be a harsh reminder for some who will be alone again, who can't participate in davening or meals or be with family the way they want, how can they tap into their own inner resiliency? What kind of qualities should they try to draw out from themselves?
Do you have another hour? I don't know. I'll talk about some of the points that we emphasize. Some may be simpler and some more profound than others. One thing is almost all, whether it's pandemics or other kind of crises, have beginning, middles, and ends. There's very few that just linger on and never end. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves, this crisis, as devastating as it has been, and I have to tell you, our trauma team, what we've dealt with these past few months has been staggering in terms of the destruction and the ill health and death, but it will end. There will be a conclusion. There was a conclusion to the Spanish flu. There was a conclusion even to World War II, the Holocaust, whatever. This will end. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves that this is not forever. The other thing that makes this so difficult, and I think, Rabbi, you alluded to that, is we just don't know it. We don't understand. We don't know, even if we accept the fact, then what's going to be the trajectory? Is it over? Is it going to get worse? What's going to happen? I mean, we're working right now a lot with schools that are opening up. And many of the messages we're giving the teachers is be prepared to shut down, because we don't know what's going to happen. Or as I love to quote Yogi Berra, that predicting is very difficult, especially about the future. It's very hard to know what's going to be, and we have to live with this uncertainty. But and here's a little bit more of a sort of sophisticated approach, which is that fits very neatly with our life as Orthodox Jews. Because as ma'aminim, as believers, whether it's Orthodox Jews or any other person who believes in the higher power and the Almighty, surrendering to what we don't know, surrendering to what's going to happen, and to know that as crazy, insane, and painful as it seems, somebody's in the control switch. Somebody's making this happen. Again, is the right way from a hashkafic point of view. That's not for me to talk about, but it's also very good psychologically. It relieves some of that tension about so much of the unknown, and can even actually further entrench our faith. So as we face this uncertainty, one of the excellent ways to cope is just to surrender to it, and know that somehow or another, this is going to be, in ways that may be unfathomable to us, somehow good.
Okay, we appreciate that. If there are any other questions people want to submit in the chat, we'll give one more moment. If not, Dr.
Okay,
Blumenthal,
sure.
thank you. We wish you a refuah shlema, a speedy recovery.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your own health challenge, and feel better, feel well. And thank you for your time. Thank you for continuing to inspire and elevate our community. And really, it was outstanding to open our minds and lift our minds in this Elul. So thank you so much. We look forward, please God, to welcome you again in person soon.
Very soon.
Wishing you chasima tova.
Amen. Hopefully in the winter.
The winter, absolutely.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. And chasima tova to all of you. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.